Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. With Dr. John Weil, the Dean of our college, I welcome all of you here today to the Honors Lecture Series on American Values. Those of you who are students in the Honors College know that this is a class, a one-hour class whose topic changes every semester, and it's one of the classes required for graduation from the University Honors College. In addition to that, it's also a series that is free and open to the public, and I say that today especially because I am pleased to see so many people in the room. We are absolutely at capacity. So all of you who are visiting today, thank you for coming. I know that we'll have a very good lecture. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Mary Evans, who is my co-facilitator, to come and make the introduction.
Hey everybody, good afternoon. We're pleased to have our very own from the Department of Political Science and International Relations, Dr. Sekou Franklin, here to speak to us today. He is not only an associate professor at our own university, but he's coordinator of the Urban Studies minor here at MTSU, and author of After the Rebellion, Black Youth, Social Movement Activism, and the Post-Civil Rights Generation, published in 2014 by NYU Press, New York University. He's also edited for the Urban League of Middle Tennessee, the State of Blacks in Middle Tennessee, and has a forthcoming book with his co-author Ray Block on race and Tennessee politics from the University of Georgia Press, forthcoming. In November of 2014, during the last presidential election, he coordinated the Tennessee Election Protection Hotline in collaboration with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and he's worked on voting rights cases of all sorts across our state and the general southeastern region. In addition, he was appointed to the Tennessee Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 2016, and he serves on the coordinating committee of Democracy Nashville Democratic Communities. He's currently president-elect of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, and he and his wife and two lovely daughters live in Nashville. Dr. Franklin, we're thrilled to have you join us.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Dr. Evans and the American Values Project, as well as Dr. Phillips for inviting me and for hosting this lecture. I see Dr. John Weil here, Jenna Logue, a number of friends here. And what I want to do today in the next 20 minutes or so, give or take, is I want to provide a unique perspective that differs from our typical portrait of the civil rights movement. I will focus on a well-known but under-researched initiative in the civil rights movement, typically known as the Citizenship Schools, or the Citizenship Education Program, as it was often called. This program operated from 1957 to 1970. It's part of a larger research project that I've been wanting to write about for a number of years, but admittedly, sometimes academicians are afraid to write about topics, and sometimes we're gung-ho about writing about topics. And this is a topic that I've been wanting to write about for years, but I've had some hesitancy for different reasons. But it's part of a larger research project that looks at nonviolent resistance, primarily coming out of the civil rights movement. And much of this research here today draws upon a unique set of archives at the Emory University Rose Library that is really a treasure trove of information regarding the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Citizenship Schools, as I described earlier, was less heralded than many of the other civil rights initiatives, particularly the Freedom School program, which, if you're really into civil rights, was organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Citizenship Schools was primarily led by women in the movement. In fact, out of its 6 main national staff persons, 4 were women. Many of these individuals had the flexibility through the citizenship program to navigate a very complicated, in many respects, patriarchal or ministerial, black male ministerial-led movement in many respects. And it was really designed to organize and recruit African Americans who were primarily at the poorest rungs of the economic ladder. Illiterate, semi-literate, those African Americans who often lived not just at the poverty line, but below the poverty line. And to initially focus on focused as an adult literacy program. How do you bring these African Americans into the educational mainstream and to learn to read and write and understand labor contracts and the sharecroppers, understand how to, for example, open up a bank account in places where they were historically excluded. But then it essentially evolved into a program that was holistic, primarily focusing on voter literacy, voting rights, voter education, and really preparing frontline activists for major types of repression in the civil rights movement. So I'm going to talk a lot about that in the next few minutes as we move forward. It's important to note that regarding the citizenship schools, they also operated during a unique period of American political history. In 1957, Congress, during the Eisenhower years, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That law is typically seen as a watered-down civil rights law, but despite that, that law established a civil rights division for the first time in this country, for the first time since Reconstruction, I should say. The Justice Department had civil rights attorneys who could go into the South and begin to bring cases. So the citizenship schools found a way to essentially understand and leverage that process. In 1964, under Lyndon B. Johnson, Congress and the President adopted the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And although that law primarily dealt with desegregation in the area of public accommodations, there was a less known provision called Title VIII, which mandated the collection of data and statistics regarding voter registration rates, particularly in the South. So again, that law itself was also deemed as a way for the citizenship schools to leverage the political process and to really have a broader, holistic understanding of voter literacy. So the citizenship program began as an adult literacy school, as I mentioned earlier, primarily training illiterate and poor residents, initially in South Carolina, in the rudiments of citizenship. It immediately incorporated voter engagement and literacy activities and pressured local governments to expand and enforce the civil rights laws of the 1950s and 1960s. By 1968, the year that Dr. King was assassinated, the citizenship schools, also known as the Citizenship Education Program, had already trained thousands of Southerners. By some accounts, 8,000 civil rights workers were trained in the Dorchester Training Academy alone in frontline civil rights activism and adult literacy. Many of these individuals came from deep South states, and most of them came from rural jurisdictions in the South. So we're not talking about just urban jurisdictions such as Jackson and Nashville. We're talking about the Mississippi Delta. We're talking about the first and second congressional districts of South Carolina and the first congressional district of Georgia and northern Louisiana. And let me translate that for people in this audience. If you organize there in those areas, if you're a civil rights worker, you almost had to sign a will because it could possibly mean death in those areas for civil rights activists. The citizenship schools has its origins, however, I should point out, in the Gullah region of South Carolina. If you were to see this map, there's a small island called the St. John Island. And this is an outpost along this coast in which African Americans or enslaved persons essentially migrated to and really developed their own distinct culture and tradition, their own distinct language and dialect. And popular discourse, if you ever saw the movie Conrad with John Voight. John Voight is organizing, or being essentially he's an educator in the Gullah Islands. And so the citizenship schools got their start in this area, one of the country's poorest regions, in the Gullah Sea Islands. And in the mid-1950s, Septima Clark, a prominent black educator from South Carolina, was hired as staff by the Highlander Folk School. So this is an interesting story. Septima Clark right here is a teacher in Charleston, Columbia, and also the Gullah Sea Islands. And she's involved in real serious, heavy-duty educational desegregation efforts in the 1940s and the 1950s, and even dating back to the 1930s. She's recruited to Tennessee, Mount Eagle, about an hour from here, to work for the Highlander Folk School. And for those of you who follow civil rights movement history, the Highlander Folk School was a movement center. They would be like the Tom Brady or the Michael Jordan of civil rights activism. They were that important in the movement. Rosa Parks was trained at the Highlander 9 months before the Montgomery Boyce boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. routinely visited the Highlander. SNCC visited Highlander. Every single civil rights activist visited the Highlander to receive some level of training and education and kind of movement interaction. Highlander was formed in the 1930s by Miles Horton in order to organize workers who were marginalized, particularly in the Mid-South here in Tennessee. By the 1950s, Highlander began to focus much more attention on civil rights activism, particularly organizing interracial movement interactions, organizing both blacks and whites in the South around movement activism. So Septima Clark was recruited to Highlander in the mid-1950s, and during that period of time, she reached back to her home state of South Carolina and began to have conversations with another activist in South Carolina named Esau Jenkins, who was a prominent activist in the Gullah Islands. And through these conversations, Septima Clark, herself being a very prominent educator, came up with this idea of establishing the citizenship schools through Highlander. She recruited her cousin, Bernice Robinson, as the first citizenship school teacher. And between 1957 and 1961, Highlander, along with the St. John Island, was called the Penn Center there, a community center there, organized 58 citizenship schools. Yet by 1961 and 1962, Highlander had a major dramatic ending. They essentially were closed down by the Tennessee Attorney General, primarily because they were organizing both blacks and whites around civil rights activism. They later reopened as a Highlander Research and Education Center and moved to East Tennessee near Knoxville. But in 1961 and 1962, they essentially had to close down for a short period of time. And at this moment, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference essentially agreed to incorporate the Citizenship School into its program. So from 1962 to 1970, the Citizenship Program was organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference also hired Septima Clark from Highlander. They hired Bernice Robinson. They brought in Andrew Young. His first job, or second job rather, with the SCLC was with the Citizenship Education Program before he was brought on to the national staff. And they brought on other activists such as Anel Ponder and, of course, and Dorothy Cotton, who was the director, essentially the director of the program. So what's the underlying theory? What's the underlying theory guiding the citizenship schools? I would argue that the citizenship schools operated as the conveyor belt of the civil rights movement. So you guys know what a conveyor belt is, similar to one located in a factory. A generic definition is that it is an endless belt or chain used for carrying materials or objects short distances as from one part of a facility or building or area to another. The citizenship schools were the conveyor belt of the movement. By this I mean that when we think about the civil rights movement, we often focus on high-profile protests, the March on Washington, for example, the Birmingham protest, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Nashville sit-ins. However, what was underlying those protests? What was the infrastructure underlying those protests? Oftentimes, they were the citizenship schools. In other words, the citizenship schools mandated or essentially laid the foundation for the civil rights movement such that these protests right here were not spontaneous. They were strategic. They were anchored by indigenous activists, many of whom came from the Citizenship Program. So what were the ingredients of this conveyor belt? Well, number one is that by routinely having these workshops, often lasting from 5 to 7 days each, the citizenship schools were able to provide a constant supply of activists. So if you kind of use a military term, the citizenship schools were like the boot camp. But there was a constant supply of troops that they were providing in the movement with training regarding movement activism. Secondly, it offered, as part of the training, political mapping. Citizenship schools participants were required to do comprehensive, holistic maps of what is a political process in their town, right? Who's running for office? How do people get on commissions, right? What do the electoral laws look like? It offered a comprehensive political mapping exercise and evaluation of what was going on, particularly in these rural communities where African Americans were being excluded from participating. It also offered activist training in grassroots organizing. How do you do door knocking? Training in lobbying. How do you make phone calls? How do you write letters? Training in nonviolent activism. And I would argue it also offered a gender balance in the movement, because much of what we know about the leaders of the movement are ministers, primarily male ministers. And in this case, this is one of the major efforts in which the totality of the effort, from top to bottom, was primarily anchored by women. In addition, it offered a philosophical reinforcement. What are the ideas of citizenship? They were constantly recycled in workshops after workshop, citizenship school after citizenship school. And again, I want to emphasize this point. There was at least 1,000 of these that were conducted in the South, primarily between 1957 and 1968. Constantly reinforcing, what does nonviolent resistance look like? What are the tools and the tactics? What does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to do X, Y, and Z? And then it offered a network exchange. There were 3 major training centers for the citizenship schools. Highlander in Tennessee, the Penn Center in St. John Island and the Gola Islands, Gola Seacoast, and also the Dorchester Center, which trained at least 8,000 citizenship participants between 1962 and 1970. So the citizenship schools was a conveyor belt. If you want to understand why the March on Washington brought 250,000 people, why the Poor People's Campaign was able to lead a 2-month siege of Washington, D.C., you have to understand that they were able to reach into these indigenous communities and draw from an indigenous group of activists, many of whom were trained in citizenship schools, and offered a broader network exchange from the eastern part of Texas all the way up to the northern part of Virginia. At least 8,000 teachers were trained in the Dorchester Center of the citizenship schools. But in reality, many people say as many as 25,000 folks came through variations of citizenship school programs, workshops, 5 to 7 day training centers, and other activities. Furthermore, at least 50,000 people were trained in the citizenship school, were registered to vote by the citizenship school participants in 1962 and 1963. So in reality, what the citizenship schools did was offer a movement infrastructure. They had a training center. The participants, once they went through the 5 to 7 day workshops, were required to return home and set up local citizenship schools in their churches, their basements, their community centers. And then it offered an infusion of activists and local campaigns. One can make the argument that the civil rights movement was not one broad movement, but a collection of localized movements, town after town, block by block. And many of these activists came through the citizenship schools. And then it offered a national network of local activists. So it was a national infrastructure, such to the point that when we talk about the civil rights movement, it's very much important to say that it was not a collection of spontaneous activism. It was strategic, it was planned. You have to almost assume you have to almost draw a parallel to the military. So many of the elite movement activists liken their work to the military training soldiers, but yet they were training nonviolent civil rights activists as part of a larger nonviolent army. So out of this, the outputs, out of this conveyor belt, you saw economic justice initiatives, desegregation campaigns, the adult literacy initiative is something I'll talk about in a couple minutes, participation in major protests, lobbying, assessing local elections, and a national mobilizing infrastructure. Now, if you were lucky enough to graduate from a citizenship school at one of the training centers, you received a certificate. It was a big deal. And if you came to the Dorchester School in McIntosh, Georgia, right, and you went through a 5 to 7 day workshop, you always concluded that workshop with a dinner. Yet this was a movement dinner. This is a freedom justice dinner. How do we know? Because the menu was named as such. So if you were lucky to go to enough to graduate and go to the graduating dinner, you would drink mind-cleansing water, transformational cranberry juice, We the People tossed salad, citizenship baked chicken, freedom singing green beans, voting rights apple pie, desegregated chocolate and vanilla milk. Now in reality, this is just regular food, but you can see how this idea of freedom, justice, citizenship was infused at all levels of the citizenship workshops. So what I want to do is just in the remainder of this discussion is talk about the strategies and the larger political milieu. That is, what is the social context shaping these strategies that were embraced by the citizenship schools? So I'll briefly talk about its adult literacy initiative, its voting literacy initiative, its attention to nonviolent resistance, and its intention to crash programs. So first, the citizenship schools emerged as an adult literacy initiative, and that's very much important. That's very important. The reason why September Clark wanted to create a citizenship school was because she wanted it as a program for adults who were semi-literate and illiterate. This mattered not just because many of these adults didn't know the A's and B's. They couldn't read, right? This mattered in a sense because many of these individuals came from the poorest communities in the United States. The Citizenship School Program did an analysis of who it served. They found that in parts of the South, there were 187 counties at this time in 1960 with a per capita income of $750 a year. 182 of these counties were served by the Citizenship Education Program. So the first iteration of citizenship schools literally was like walking into the elementary school and they're going through the A's and B's of arithmetic. But on top of that, layered on top of that, was a set of instruction in which the participants were required to learn how to do a mail order. They're figuring out how to open up a bank account. They're figuring out how to apply for Social Security. This mattered because in the 1950s, Social Security was not expanded to sharecroppers and domestics, many of whom were African Americans until the 1950s. So literally, if you were a sharecropper in South Carolina in 1958 sitting in a citizenship program, right, for the first time in your life, you were able to essentially apply for Social Security, but many of them didn't know how. So walking these participants through rudimentary procedures that many of us take for granted was such an essential element of the citizenship program. How to get full value for your labor. Many examples in the South. I can tell you my family is one of them in which if you worked in the sharecropping fields, there are times in which the work contract that you negotiated wasn't honored. So they had to walk them through the A's and B's of labor contracts, Social Security information, how to deliver a mail bank order, how to open a bank account in parts of South Carolina in Mississippi, in which many African Americans were not allowed to open a bank account until the late 1960s. So this whole comprehensive adult literacy initiative was the major staple of the Citizenship School Program. There's an interesting quote that I found that helps to get to this issue. A letter came through the Citizenship Program for South Carolina describing some of the challenges that African Americans were facing in a seed packing company. And this is what the letter stated. I'm going to put quotes around this. Blacks employed at the CPAC Corporation in South Carolina are asked to sign a statement that they are handicapped employees, that they're disabled employees, thereby not entitled to the national minimum wage. They are paid 51 cents per hour after signing the forms. So if you could not read, if you could not write, then you might be encouraged to sign a form that didn't apply to you as a way to exempt you from your full value, the full value of your labor. And so these are some examples in which the adult literacy program had to address as it expanded in parts of the South. Number two, that the citizenship schools focused a lot of attention on voter literacy. In fact, really immediately what the citizenship schools evolved into was a voter education, voter literacy program, in which that probably became the primary focus, even much more so than adult literacy. Again, it's important to mention that this is a period of time in which we've seen an expansion of civil rights, potential expansion of civil rights, and the ability of African Americans in the South to leverage the 57 Voting Rights Act, 57 Civil Rights Act, and later the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But it's important to mention this, that African Americans in the South were not, even in places like South Carolina and Louisiana and Georgia, were not impotent in the 1960s and 50s. Dating back from my research as far back as the 1930s, maybe the 1920s, African Americans were establishing civic leagues, voter leagues, right? Local organizations that were organizing African Americans around voter education. How do you pass a literacy test? How do you pass an understanding test? How do you raise the money to pay for poll taxes? So by the 1950s and 1960s, the South had already been layered in many parts of the South with an indigenous organizational base that many of the participants were able to rely upon. In fact, if you look at Selma, the organization that brought Martin Luther King Jr. to Selma was the Dallas County Civic League, one of these organizations that had been around since the 1930s. So when the citizenship schools essentially emerged, what they wanted to do was to layer these African American communities with voter education and voter literacy. This mattered again because in 1964, that Title VIII allowed for the collection of registration statistics. There was a Justice Department, though feeble and weak, was still there, was still able to be leveraged potentially by many civil rights activists. So what the Citizenship Program did was incorporate a holistic, a comprehensive, deep dive analysis for the participants of what is the local politics, what are the election laws, what does it look like where they live. Bernice Robinson reported that in one training that citizenship participants evaluated maps and census reports of their home counties to outline their voter registration programs and hold mock registration scenes. Another question came up was, how do we get people excited about voter registration and education? Well, the argument that Robinson and September Clark pointed out was you had to illustrate this point. To illustrate this point, what they did was they drew up a layout of the national government. And I'll put in quotes around this. They showed them the patronage jobs available through each elected official, step by step, and how this was done. And then when it was clearly understood by the participants of how national politics operated, they asked the participants to go back to their dorms, and the next day come back with an analysis of your county governance. So this was a deep dive. The citizenship schools, they targeted, from my research, 3 congressional districts. The first is Georgia Congressional District. Why? Because in this district, there was a long history of voter crusades organizing there. And the first and second congressional districts in South Carolina, where there was a high illiteracy rate, where there's a high number of African Americans that were excluded from the right to vote, and where the citizenship schools and voter leagues had a long-standing foundation. They even organized the Bible and the ballot conferences. That is essentially reaching into biblical scriptures and finding out what it says about citizenship and participation. And out of this, you found massive numbers of people who were being registered to vote. And again, I think you could probably make a safe bet that at least 70,000 or 80,000 people, maybe much higher, was registered to vote in that period of time in the citizenship schools. At the very least, September Clark said that 50,000 people were registered over a 2-year period of time, and that number seems to have even doubled afterwards. And there's some interesting commentary about how they collected data that I can talk about after this discussion. Nonviolent resistance. This is so critical to the citizenship schools participants. So when the citizenship schools program shut down, when Highlander shut down, again, remember in 61 and 62, the Tennessee Attorney General shut down the Highlander Research Center, primarily because African Americans and whites were coming together organizing. So when SLC decided to take it up, Martin Luther King Jr. was receptive, but his only mandate was that nonviolent resistance, nonviolent philosophy be incorporated as a mainline section of the citizenship schools. So nonviolent resistance was part of this program, nonviolent training, and not nonviolence as an emotive principle, as an emotion, but strategies of nonviolence. That is, when to negotiate, when to intensify direct action, when to leverage power, what those individuals in the nonviolent movement call the science of nonviolence, not just the emotional part, but what is the underlying science? What's the politics of it? What's the strategy behind it? So this is incorporated into the movement. And of course, nonviolence allowed for many activists to deal with extreme levels of repression. Again, I want to emphasize this point. I want to do it over and over again. If you organize in many parts of the South, particularly the rural South, there was a strong possibility that you faced extreme levels of repression. And so these citizenship schools were designed to prepare, in many respects like a boot camp, activists who would have to go back to their communities and face these levels of repression. This is a quote from Annelle Ponder. She was one of the leaders of the Citizenship School program, and she was beaten in jail, actually on her way to a citizenship school, I believe. And this is her quote: "Black jabs, a belt, fists, and open palms. They all really wanted me to say, 'Yes, sir,' and that is the one thing I wouldn't say." In fact, some would argue, some activists privately believe that the beating that she received in the early 1960s contributed to her early death. Ida Holland said that she was knocked down in jail several times, used the opportunity to teach citizenship to a guard at a local jail, and check this out, I don't know how she did this, but she used nonviolence on a police dog, she says, she swears by it, who otherwise may have been bitten her. And of course, this is Sam Block, who experienced lynchings, beatings, jails, a shotgun ambush, and threats from sheriffs and ultimatums. This was the normal occurrence for many activists who were organizing around voting rights and desegregation campaigns. And so the citizenship schools had a section in which they tried to train activists to prepare for this, while at the same time using nonviolence as a broader political strategy. And finally, I'm almost near the conclusion, the other strategy was the idea of crash programs. This term kept coming up, crash programs. These were essentially survival programs. They're emergency response programs developed by citizenship school participants. Sometimes it entailed developing a bank or a credit union. Sometimes it entailed developing an economic cooperative. And that is that taking the citizenship school idea, moving beyond adult literacy, moving beyond voter literacy, moving beyond what we call nonviolence, and offering service level or emergency response welfare assistance programs, and I'm using welfare in a different kind of way than it's commonly used. So for example, in Haywood County, Tennessee, during the Tent City movement of 1959 to 1962, when students from the North came to Tennessee to work in that movement in the early 1960s, they joined work camps as a way to kind of infiltrate the rural West Tennessee Delta, and the citizenship school programs assisted with that, establishing a supermarket in Grenada, Mississippi, and offering economic relief to prevent, in many places like Mississippi, African Americans from leaving. So this is a quote by Septima Clark in which she describes an example of a crash initiative or a crash activity. And this is an individual who was maimed on the job, and this is what he said. He said, in Huntsville, Alabama, an illiterate laborer was wounded and incapacitated for life. He attended a citizenship school at his church, and he learned to file an application for disability and got his first check over a 2-year period of time. And you can see right here that the program is an answer to SLC's recognition of the fact that asking people to register and vote is not enough, but an individual needs to essentially learn how to survive in a climate that is both economically and politically difficult for them to survive. Finally, let me conclude by saying this and really kind of trying to wrap up this, what I think is perhaps the most important initiative of the civil rights movement. Today, there are many discussions about citizenship, yet those discussions are primarily tied to residential identity, whether one is born in the United States. Residential identity is automatically understood or often understood or misunderstood as what it means to be a good citizen. Yet the Citizenship School program reimagines citizenship. Dorothy Cotton, the director of the SLC Citizenship School Training Program, had this segment during each workshop called Being a Citizen. And during that segment, what she did was to ask this question, what is a citizen? And for her, a citizen was not one who was tied to a descriptive identity. That is, I was born in the United States, and I have certain rights that are different from that are different from other folks. For her, a good citizen was being able to transform one's social and political context. And this mattered a great deal, particularly for African Americans who were being brought into the citizenship program. Because although many of them, in fact, 99% of them, were born in the United States, their parents were born in the United States, and their grandparents were in the United States, they were not recognized as full citizens. They were not given access to full participation. And many of these individuals were laborers, workers, military veterans, and students who fueled the economy of the South. So perhaps the most important aspect of the citizenship school programs is that they redefine and reimagine citizenship and basically redefine who matters politically. Who matters politically is not just, according to the citizenship participants, middle-class individuals who have the ability to immediately grasp how politics works, but it involves those individuals who are considered to be social outcasts. Those individuals who may be formerly incarcerated, those people living below the poverty line, those people who may be undocumented. It's a contemporary lesson, but it attempts to reimagine who matters politically in terms of our unique understanding of citizenship. It moves beyond a non-descriptive understanding and allows those individuals coming through the program to transform their social context. That is, that to move beyond a state of inferiority in which they believe that they can't get anything done, they can't make any change, because of where they live and to figure out that they can make change even if they may be semi-literate or even if they may be illiterate. So, citizenship. Septima Clark put it best. She said, the main characteristic of our citizenship program is its development of local leaders, indigenous leaders, who have been challenged to assume responsibility for determining their own future. And I'll conclude there by just reemphasizing the point that the citizenship program really offered a supply chain and provided a boot camp for many movement activists who really anchored what I think is one of the most important transformative set of events of the 20th century.
Absolutely time for questions here, and any question that you have for Dr. Franklin. And also, where does this put us here, our students, our university, in terms of our American value and citizenship? And it's not just about birth. What do we do with that? You've got a question for Dr. Franklin.
Dr. Franklin, I actually have a question regarding the citizenship schools and how you said that they had trained up certain groups of people to go out to protest, whatever the case may be. When they sent those out to do the smaller schools, is that what those were for? Were they trained for specific, like the national programs, things like that? They trained them to go and find other people, and that was their specific purpose when they went down there? Or was
Yeah, so
they went good and came back, got something new, and then went out to do something different?
It's probably multiple things, but in an ideal outcome would be that an individual was recruited to the citizenship schools, let's say, for example, from Macomb, Mississippi. That person would attend the Dorchester Training Center. He or she would then go back to their community and organize an additional citizenship school or workshop for individuals who were specifically interested in getting involved in the civil rights activities. In reality, what happened was that many of the participants were coming from communities in which there were ongoing local campaigns. So the idea that someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, went to the citizenship school training program. But when she went back home to the Mississippi Delta, there's already an ongoing voter registration, voting rights campaign, desegregation campaign in the community. So there was a natural absorption, so to speak, of people who went through the training to go back into the communities to be absorbed in that. In some cases, some individuals use the citizenship training for their own, to use a political science term, casework. That is helping individuals, for example, to get debt relief, helping individuals to fill out their Social Security, in which those activities were not tied to an ongoing civil rights campaign, but were tied to, for example, the role that a preacher plays in his or her church with their congregation members. So there was a multitude of pathways that an individual could come into the citizenship schools, and there was a multitude of pathways that an individual could take the skills that they learned and use it to deal with the day-to-day community work. If that makes any sense. But in a broader sense, in an ideal sense, there was a natural tie between local grassroots civil rights activities and the training that they received, and that essentially reinforced each other.
I'm curious about the actual daily operations of these schools, particularly being in the South and the Deep South. Were they in nondescript buildings, or were there safety protocols for the students? And also, how is all of this funded?
Yeah, those two questions. I'll answer that last question first. The Citizenship Schools program, they were fortunate. They received donations and funding. There are two funding entities that funded the Citizenship Schools at their height. One was something called, I believe, the Marshall Field Foundation, and there was something called the American Missionary Association. And those two entities provided, from what I can tell based on archives, a large amount of grants for that. Now, when you spread the money all out, then a citizenship school trainer or teacher is not getting paid that much money. But that's for the most part how those programs were funded. And the other thing I didn't mention was that in the early 1960s, there was a robust debate, kind of a fight that took place inside of the movement. The Southern Regional Council, through an agreement with the Justice Department, particularly Robert Kennedy, developed a voter education project somewhere around 1962. it almost split up the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but they survived it. So what happened ultimately was that the civil rights movement split into two wings. It didn't split, but it essentially, there was a division of labor. And one wing was voter registration, particularly supported by the VEP, the Voter Education Project, through the Southern Regional Council and through the Justice Department. And the other wing focused on desegregation. So the idea that you had this voter education project already operating in the South made those individuals who were focusing on voter registration and voter literacy more apt to raise funds, donations, money through basic foundations. But to your first point, absolutely, they organized workshops in libraries, in schools, in churches. Probably the best example would be a church or a school or a building, but they often did face repression. There's example after example after example in the archives in which literally a group wants to set up a citizenship school in northern Louisiana, and they had to close the workshop because of threat of intimidation. There's examples in which maybe a sheriff might appear and ask for the names of people who attended the citizenship schools. So it is often the case that the citizenship school programs or citizenship workshops got disrupted because of the kind of repression and intimidation that operated. So they just had to deal with that and negotiate that. And they would come to the training centers and they would tell the stories in which, I tried to do a workshop in my neighborhood, in my community, but it was closed down by the local sheriff. Or people said they were afraid to attend because if they attended, their name could be on the sheet and they could lose their job for doing so. Yeah. That's why the training centers were so important, because the training centers offered a getaway and a safe place to have these trainings. But when they went back home and did the workshops, that's when they faced some of the problems and challenges. Yeah.
Other questions? Several.
I'll let you choose, yeah.
Sir, go ahead.
Did any programs that are possibly still around that came like a byproduct of this, or is there any programs that are still around that came from that?
Yeah, I mean the idea of the Citizenship Education Project is long-standing. It preceded SLC. There are different variations of it in labor movements, in women's movements, through the settlement houses, and even afterwards today, there are variations of citizenship education initiatives. If you just, I did a kind of a Google search online, and a lot of things come up where universities will have a citizenship education program, where a grassroots organization will have one. I work with a group in Nashville in which we're trying to do something similar. So the idea translates to the modern context, but also preceded the SCLCs and the Highlanders program as well.
Yeah, cool. We actually had the same question, but I guess I'll just add on to it. You said you work with a group in Nashville and you're trying to implement new programs similar to this one. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, I mean, the group that we're trying to work with, we're trying to use a citizenship school model to, we haven't launched it yet, but I kind of played around with the term civic and political literacy schools. And the two initiatives we're trying to work on is the first one is criminal justice issues. That is, how do you navigate the criminal justice system? How do you get everyday people to lobby for legislation? And that's a prime opportunity right there, because in Middle Tennessee, probably the most robust and activism going on right now is around criminal justice, and it's multiracial. It's real layered in, formerly incarcerated persons, women, and it has bipartisan support in many cases. In fact, one example of that is there's a group here in Middle Tennessee led by formerly incarcerated women. They have a bill that has a good chance of passing around community rehabilitation. So that's one idea, but my interest also is in voting rights. So if we do launch something, we're probably going to focus on how to develop like election protection, local networks that monitor elections, that can look out for irregularities in the voting booth, that can look out for machines that are busted. So trying to build that process out is something that we've been talking about for about 2 years, but I think we're probably going to move in that direction of, finding some resources and money to put it together. Yeah.
Other questions? Sir.
curious about something else. How did these schools engage with faith communities in the South?
Well, the civil rights movement, the faith community, at least the African American church, Christian church in particular, and citizenship schools were all, it was like a hand that fits a glove. So one of the things that some of the citizenship schools did, which can be quite controversial, is that some of them actually had in their curriculum how to be a better Christian. So what they were trying to do was to see Christianity and the Bible as a social justice instrument that can transform their social context. So some of that literature, some of that basis was actually incorporated in the citizenship schools because many of these individuals came from, you come out of Mississippi Delta, you're coming from a community that's deeply anchored in Black church tradition, Black Christian church tradition. So there was a hand that fits the glove kind of identity with the Black church and the citizenship school program.
Are there others?
I was wondering how the networking worked for the citizenship programs. Like, were there people that were like actively like advertising these, or did people kind of like, word spread around eventually?
Oh yes, absolutely. So the civil rights movement had what some call the Big Five or Big Four organizations: the SCLC, King's Group, the NAACP, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, in its heyday, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Urban League, and they had different iterations or different ancillary groups, like the Southern Regional Council, like the voter leagues, and there was movement. I call it movement borrowing, or movement exchanges. There are individuals who, might belong to SNCC, but would go to a training at Highlander, in which you had SCLC people. You had individuals who were in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who were going to Mississippi and being placed in a home, being placed in the community where they live with the local NAACP leader in Greenwood, Mississippi, or Macomb, Mississippi. So there was a constant movement exchange and constant movement borrowing, such to the point that some of the initiatives, the citizenship schools and the freedom schools, the lines were blurred. Like, who's doing it? Is it SNCC? Is it SCLC? And then they would have retreats. So all these movement formations had their own retreats, planning retreats. They had an SLC planning retreat. They had a SNCC planning retreat. So there was constant movement exchange between the various organizations, between the various activists at various training centers. And so through these exchanges, they were able to recruit individuals to the Freedom School. So for example, the reason why the citizenship schools came into the Delta, Mississippi, was because in the Delta, Mississippi, some of the SNCC folks recruited or asked, I believe, I'm on camera, so I gotta be careful, I'm gonna add an asterisk by it, so I gotta double check that just in case. But they encouraged some of the citizenship school leaders to come into Mississippi Delta to help out with voter literacy initiatives. So the lines were blurred constantly. Anel Ponder, who was beaten up severely, said, SNCC folks would say, we always thought she was SNCC, but she was SCLC, right? And so through these movement exchanges, there was constant recruitment, where if you went through a workshop, a 5 to 7 day workshop, and you went back home to the rural Georgia area, to the Black Belt of Alabama, you often would recruit individuals. And then, so a lot of activists were retrained. So they went through 2 or 3 trainings, and the next time they went to a training, they brought 3 or 4 more people to the training. That makes any sense. So the movement is not like a regression analysis, or it doesn't run in this straight line. The movement recruitment, the movement borrowing, yes, no doubt about it, there's an infrastructure. Yes, it's not spontaneous to activists. Yes, there's strategy, but the borrowing, the exchanges, the networking, it's like this. It's not functional like 2 + 2 = 4, but it's like a person can come to the citizenship school, go to their home, and work with a local pastor on getting debt relief for a person and never get involved in activism, but oftentimes they would go back to their home and they would try to do a workshop, and then the workshop might have a participant from SNCC or the NAACP, and then they would go back and get retraining. So it's all over. It was like this versus, say, moving in a straight line. It's not like a linear regression.
With the program that you said you're kind of playing around with, are there more like kind of, I guess, items on your list that you want to like address for the African American community, or is civil rights, I guess, within the police force one of like the only one, I guess?
Well, right now we're just looking at those two issues because that's within our bandwidth, but they don't have to be exclusive. You have immigrant rights activists that may do initiative. You may have folks focusing on organizing workers that may do something. So for us, it's only those two initiatives, but we haven't got it started yet. There's another group actually in Tennessee that's been doing, and it's pushing some really good bills. I mean, we're in an area, we're in a state where the level of activism around criminal justice is really robust. And the irony about it is, if you want to look at bipartisanship, it's one of the areas of bipartisanship that you find taking place in the state. And another group, I would say, No Prisoners Exception Collective, is actually doing more robust criminal justice training, akin to a mini or scaled down version of the citizenship schools, but they could be around anything. People could set them up around anything. But the important point about the citizenship school program with the SLC was that they had a curriculum, and it was a handbook. It was similar to, a curriculum that a student would get at a high school, and they were constantly revising their curriculum. And as they grew, they were bringing in more experts to update the curriculum. So if someone is interested in doing this, you just don't want to necessarily throw people out there. You want to have a very tight curriculum that the individuals who go to that program can leave with, and of course, and I have some examples of the Citizenship Program curriculum. And again, a lot of the topics seem elementary. That's the thing, and they seem like how do you spell how do you spell house? How do you do arithmetic? But again, you got to understand that in many of these communities, the literacy rate was so extreme that basic math, basic arithmetic was literally essential to figuring out. It was literally essential to determining whether or not the plantation owner that you work for, whether or not he or she was going to steal your wages. Because you would sign a contract, and that contract could have anything in it. So all these sharecroppers were getting their wages stolen. Or it was literally determining whether or not, during the Eisenhower years, finally Social Security was expanded to include domestics and sharecroppers and farm workers. And so that sharecropper for the first time was able to finally apply to Social Security if he or she built up enough quarters or hours working. But they didn't know how to fill out a Social Security application. So a lot of stuff seems rudimentary, elementary. And so in the actual curriculum, when you read the handbook, it's literally walking people through stuff that maybe those of us take for granted today. And then it incorporated in a very, very enormous way this voter stuff, this constant voter stuff. Know what's going on in your community. Yeah.
Are there others? I want to ask this, Dr. Franklin. How are our universities, how's MTSU functioning as a citizenship school today?
By sponsoring this lecture, we have some. I don't know if there's a coordinated effort, but we do have a lot of outreach coming out of this university in the community around some of these issues. But I don't know if there's like a coordinated effort. Unless I would let Dr. Vile answer that question since he's been here longer than me.
Well, certainly you can major in political science and learn a lot that way.
But I would, of course, like to argue that the majority of folks don't major in political science, and yet we're all citizens, and that we should be gleaning our citizenship education constantly across all of our disciplines.
And I'll say this last thing. Although the Citizenship School program, again, dealt with often the poorest of the poor, in many respects they raised the bar for citizenship because it didn't define citizenship as an ascriptive identity. That is, am I born in the United States? It defines citizenship as how can I personally transform myself to transform my social and political context, and then what is my role in what? Participating in the political process, right? That right there is a different question because that forces all of us to what? Reconfigure what is our role in what? Voting, improving the political process, understanding election laws, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our speakers.